The quiet hum of machines filled the hospital room, each beep marking the fragile seconds of Marcus Hale's life. A man once known for commanding boardrooms and commanding headlines now lay powerless, his body frail, his breath uneven. Around him, relatives spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with sorrow. At the bedside, his wife, Lila, held his hands so tightly her fingers trembled, unwilling to let go as if sheer will could keep him anchored. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with fatigue, but within them lingered something unspoken, a weight carried too long. It wasn't just illness draining him, it was regret pressing on his chest harder than any failing heart could. Those gathered sensed that his silence held more than fear of death. Marcus was a man who had built an empire on control, yet here, in his final moments, control had slipped away. He wasn't only facing the end of life, he was confronting a truth he had buried for years, a truth that threatened to shatter the love of the woman sitting faithfully at his side. Marcus Hale had lived the kind of life most could only dream about. Wealth, status, power, all within his grasp before the age of 45. His name commanded respect in financial circles. His face adorned magazine covers. His decisions could move markets. To outsiders, he seemed untouchable, the model of success. Yet here he was, frail and silent, reduced to a man at the mercy of time. A man who had everything, yet carried a secret that would haunt his final breath. The truth he had hidden for so long now pressed against his conscience, demanding release before it was too late. Every accolade, every fortune, every headline seemed meaningless compared to the quiet weight in his chest. For years, he had worn the mask of a confident leader, but beneath that mask was a man terrified of the one revelation that could destroy the life he had built. This was not just the story of wealth and ambition. It was the story of how even the strongest can be undone by the silence of their own hearts. Let me ask you something. What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you built your life around, revealed a truth that could change everything at the very end? Would you feel betrayed, knowing the years you shared were built on silence? Would you lash out, letting anger speak louder than love? Or would you search for understanding, even in the shadow of heartbreak? Every relationship carries hidden corners, moments unspoken, fears left buried, truths we tuck away believing they protect the ones we love. But when those truths finally surface, the bond between two hearts is tested in ways words can barely describe. Lila Hale sat at her husband's bedside, unaware that the man she had stood by through wealth, hardship, and doubt was about to place her in that very position. Soon she would be forced to answer a question no one ever wants to face. Is love strong enough to survive the truth? Let me ask you something. What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you built your life around, revealed a truth that could change everything at the very end? Would you feel betrayed, knowing the years you shared were built on silence? Would you lash out, letting anger speak louder than love? Or would you search for understanding, even in the shadow of heartbreak? Every relationship carries hidden corners, moments unspoken, fears left buried, truths we tuck away believing they protect the ones we love. But when those truths finally surface, the bond between two hearts is tested in ways words can barely describe. Lila Hale sat at her husband's bedside, unaware that the man she had stood by through wealth, hardship, and doubt was about to place her in that very position. Soon she would be forced to answer a question no one ever wants to face. Is love strong enough to survive the truth? So I ask you, when the truth finally slipped from Marcus Hale's lips, what could his wife possibly do? Would she collapse beneath the weight of betrayal, or would she choose a response that no one in that room could have imagined? Her final act, carried out in the presence of family and loved ones, left everyone speechless. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was something far greater, a choice that would echo long after Marcus drew his last breath. Welcome to Tales by Williams. If you're new here, thank you for joining us, and if you've been with us before, welcome back. This channel is where stories of love, hardship, and redemption come to life, stories that remind us of the lessons hidden within the human heart. If you believe in the power of storytelling to inspire, to teach, and to move us closer to compassion, then I invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share this story, because each voice in this community helps keep these lessons alive. To the outside world, Marcus Hale was the embodiment of modern success. His photograph appeared regularly on glossy magazine covers, the headlines hailing him as a visionary in finance. Journalists praised his bold strategies. Competitors spoke of his sharp instincts, and shareholders admired the way his decisions seemed to turn opportunities into gold. His face was instantly recognizable at high-profile charity galas, his name spoken with admiration in boardrooms across the country. He lived in a penthouse that seemed to stretch into the clouds, its wide windows offering a view of a city he practically ruled. The garages held cars that gleamed like trophies, symbols of wealth acquired not merely through inheritance, but through years of relentless ambition. His days were filled with flights to international conferences, private meetings with dignitaries, and evenings spent at events where every handshake seemed to seal another lucrative partnership. Those who only knew Marcus from the outside assumed he had achieved the perfect life. Power, influence, recognition, all rested within his grasp. He was portrayed as a man untouchable, his story written like a triumph that had no shadows. Yet even at the height of acclaim, there was an unspoken truth. Success can blind the world to the burdens carried behind closed doors. Yet beyond the polished headlines and the carefully staged photographs, Marcus Hale's life was not as flawless as it seemed. Behind the walls of his penthouse, the weight of his responsibilities pressed harder than any spotlight ever could. The same man who dazzled audiences with confidence often returned home exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes carrying the fatigue of battles no one else could see. At business dinners, his charm rarely faltered, but in the quiet of his own home, a different Marcus emerged. He would retreat into silence, sitting for long stretches without speaking, his thoughts far away. The man who inspired awe in colleagues struggled to find ease at his own dining table. He laughed less freely, smiled less often, and when conversation drifted toward personal matters, he would change the subject with practiced ease. This contrast was invisible to the public eye. To the world, Marcus was celebrated, envied, even imitated. To those closest to him, however, there were hints, fleeting moments when the sparkle of success dimmed and shadows crept across his expression. These moments didn't erase his achievements, but they revealed something more complex, a man whose public victories could not silence the private battles he refused to name. Amid the glittering world that surrounded Marcus, Lila stood out for entirely different reasons. She wasn't the type of woman to be impressed by wealth or seduced by prestige. Her strength came not from status but from character, a quiet dignity that drew people in without effort. When others admired Marcus for his empire, Lila was admired for her warmth. She had met him long before his name commanded such power. At a charity event, while others sought attention and recognition, Lila was busy arranging meals for struggling families, her sleeves rolled up, her focus entirely on service. Marcus, a man accustomed to sharp suits and sharper conversations, had been disarmed by her simplicity. In her presence, he felt seen not as a powerful figure but as a man, flawed, human, and in need of love. Throughout their marriage, Lila became the anchor in Marcus's storm. She offered perspective when ambition threatened to consume him, reminding him that kindness mattered as much as profit. She celebrated his victories without being blinded by them and endured his long absences without resentment. Her presence softened the sharp edges of his world, grounding him in values that money could never buy. For all his wealth, it was Lila's love that gave Marcus's life meaning. And yet, it was also the very thing his silence endangered. Still, even with Lila's steady presence, traces of distance began to show. At family gatherings, Marcus would steer conversations back to business whenever personal questions arose. When his colleagues joked about friendships or childhood memories, he would deflect with a smile, offering polished remarks that revealed nothing. In the privacy of his home, the cracks deepened. Some evenings ended with him staring out through the tall windows of their penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze fixed on the city lights below. He would stand there in silence, as though the view might distract him from the thoughts he could never share. Lila often approached gently, asking, "What's troubling you?" But Marcus would brush her concern aside with the same line, "Just business, nothing more." Though she never pushed, Lila could feel the distance. The man she had married, the one who once spoke with her about dreams, fears, and hopes, was slowly closing off parts of himself. Success had not freed Marcus. It had locked him behind a wall of secrecy. And that silence, though invisible to others, whispered louder to Lila with every passing year. From the beginning, their union had been a subject of speculation. When Marcus first introduced Lila as the woman he intended to marry, many in his social circle raised eyebrows. Associates whispered in private lounges that she wasn't the type of wife expected for a man of his stature. Some described her as too modest. Others questioned whether she could adapt to the glittering world of wealth and power that surrounded Marcus. At company events, colleagues would exchange glances as Lila moved through the room with quiet composure rather than loud confidence. She wasn't adorned in extravagant jewelry, nor did she compete for attention. Instead, she carried herself with humility, speaking more about community work than about investments or markets. To many in Marcus's world, that simplicity seemed like a weakness, not a strength. Even Marcus's family, proud of his accomplishments, wondered privately if Lila could ever truly belong. "She doesn't fit," one relative once muttered after a holiday dinner. Yet Marcus dismissed such comments with conviction. He didn't choose Lila because she fit into his world. He chose her because she offered him peace in a world that constantly demanded more. Still, the whispers never fully faded. They lingered at the edges of their marriage like a shadow, testing their bond with doubts that came from outside rather than within. And while Marcus brushed aside those opinions, Lila often carried the weight of judgment in silence, proving her devotion not through words but through steadfast loyalty. As Marcus's career flourished, so did the rumors. Whispers spread through corporate hallways and upscale dinner parties that women were drawn to him during his frequent business trips. His charm, combined with his influence, made him the subject of speculation wherever he went. Some claimed to have seen him in the company of admirers. Others hinted at private encounters that blurred the line between truth and exaggeration. These stories made their way back to Lila, carried on the lips of people who believed they were warning her, or perhaps hoping to see cracks in her confidence. "You should be careful," one acquaintance once told her, with a tone more pointed than sympathetic. But Lila refused to let gossip dictate her trust. She understood the difference between rumor and reality, and she had chosen to believe in the man she knew at home, not the image others painted of him. Her faith in Marcus wasn't blind, it was deliberate. She remembered the moments of tenderness others never saw, the quiet evenings when he laid his head in her lap, the way he sought her. Comfort after exhausting days, the private gestures that revealed his true dependence on her presence. These were not the actions of a man whose heart belonged elsewhere. So she stood firm. She ignored the chatter, refusing to allow suspicion to poison her marriage. In a world where trust is easily eroded by whispers, Lila's choice to believe in Marcus became both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. Despite Lila's unwavering trust, there were signs that something unspoken stood between them. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, no shouting, no visible betrayal. Instead, it was the subtle kind of distance that creeps in quietly, unnoticed by others, but impossible for a spouse to miss. Marcus had a way of withdrawing at unexpected moments, During dinners, when conversation shifted toward family or personal reflections, his responses grew shorter. At times, he would excuse himself early, retreating to his office with the explanation of work still left undone. Lila knew he was dedicated, but she also sensed that not every absence could be explained by business alone. In their bedroom, where intimacy once flowed with ease, Marcus sometimes seemed distracted, his thoughts elsewhere. He offered affection, yes, but it often carried a weight, as though his mind was split between the present and something he refused to name. On certain nights, when Lila reached for him, she could feel the tension in his body, a quiet resistance that he masked with a tired smile. Then there were his solitary rituals, the evenings he spent staring out at the city lights, glass in hand, saying little. When she pressed him gently, his answers never changed. "Just stress," he would mutter. "It'll pass." To anyone else, it would have seemed trivial. But to Lila, it was clear that her husband carried a hidden burden, one he kept locked away behind a wall she could not breach. And though their love remained strong, the silence between them began to speak louder than words. What made the silence so heavy was not what Marcus had done, but what he had withheld. There was no scandal splashed across headlines, no undeniable act of disloyalty. Instead, the fracture came from omission, the deliberate choice to conceal something from the woman who had given him her whole heart. Trust in marriage is built not only on fidelity, but also on openness. Lila never doubted that Marcus loved her, yet she felt the invisible weight of what he refused to share. His evasions, his long pauses, his tired reassurances, they all carried the unmistakable mark of a man protecting a secret. And that was the wound she couldn't name aloud. Not that he had strayed, but that he hadn't trusted her enough to confide in her. The absence of truth was its own form of betrayal, one that gnawed slowly at the foundation of their bond. For Lila, every unspoken word carried significance. She had offered him her loyalty, her patience, and her strength, asking only for honesty in return. When Marcus withheld it, she felt not anger but sorrow. Sorrow that the man who sought her compassion in every storm could not also trust her with his deepest storm of all. It wasn't an explosive betrayal, it was a quiet one, and in many ways that made it hurt even more. Before we continue, let me ask you directly, have you ever kept a secret believing it would protect someone you love, only to discover that the silence caused even greater harm? Secrets don't always arrive with scandal. Sometimes they slip in quietly, hidden beneath good intentions, cloaked as protection. Yet, when the truth finally emerges, it often cuts deeper than the very pain we tried to shield others from. Marcus believed he was safeguarding his marriage, his reputation, his carefully built life. But in doing so, he created a wall that grew taller with each passing year, a wall that even Lila's devotion could not climb. His choice reminds us of a difficult reality. It isn't always betrayal through action that wounds the deepest. It's betrayal through silence. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever felt the weight of a secret, whether keeping it or being kept in the dark? Your perspective might help others who are wrestling with the same questions today. The turning point came without warning. Marcus had spent the day in his office, reviewing reports and preparing for yet another round of meetings. To those around him, it seemed like any other day in the relentless rhythm of his career. His staff saw the familiar signs of fatigue, the tightened jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers against the desk, but no one imagined how close he stood to the edge. Late that evening, as the office lights dimmed and most employees had gone home, Marcus remained at his desk. His assistant had urged him to rest, but he waved her off with his usual line, "Just a little longer." He leaned forward, scanning the numbers on his screen, his hand clutching a pen as though sheer determination could push away the exhaustion that had been mounting for months. Then it happened. A sharp pain gripped his chest, stealing his breath. The pen slipped from his hand and rolled onto the floor. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him, sending him crashing against the polished wood. Papers scattered, the sound echoing through the nearly empty floor. For the first time in his life, Marcus Hale, the man who had commanded empires with confidence, lay helpless, gasping for air, his body finally demanding what his pride had long denied: surrender. Panic spread among the few staff who remained. Shouts filled the hallway as someone called for an ambulance. In those frantic moments, the carefully maintained image of power and control shattered. Marcus was no longer the untouchable leader. He was a man brought down by the very weight he had carried in silence. As paramedics rushed through the glass doors and lifted him onto a stretcher, Marcus's thoughts were not on balance sheets or profits. They were on the secret he had buried for years, the truth that now pressed harder than the failing of his heart. And as the sirens wailed through the night, one thought consumed him. Time was running out. The hospital room carried a stillness that pressed heavily on everyone present. The steady rhythm of machines broke the silence, each beep marking the fragile line between life and loss. Monitors flickered, displaying numbers that meant everything to the doctors and nothing to the family who only saw the men they loved fighting for breath. Marcus lay in the center of it all, his skin pale, his strength diminished. The powerful aura that once defined him had faded into vulnerability, leaving only a man caught between past choices and an uncertain tomorrow. Tubes and wires connected him to equipment designed to sustain what his own body could no longer manage alone. Around his bed, family gathered. Lila never left his side, her hand clasped firmly over his, her eyes refusing to wander from his face. Every rise and fall of his chest brought her a fleeting hope, followed by fear that the next breath might be his last. His sister Celine stood nearby, arms folded tightly as though holding herself together, her sharp gaze fixed on her brother. Other relatives lingered at the edges of the room, whispering among themselves, too aware of the gravity in the air to speak aloud. Doctors entered periodically, their voices low, their explanations laced with medical terms that offered little comfort. Words like unstable and critical circled the room, unspoken reminders that the family was preparing not just for treatment, but for the possibility of goodbye. Lila leaned close to her husband, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead, whispering words of reassurance he was too weak to fully answer. "I'm here, Marcus. I won't leave you," she promised, her voice trembling yet steady with devotion. To her, his condition wasn't measured by numbers on a screen, but by the memories they had shared, anniversaries, laughter, quiet nights when love seemed enough to carry them through anything. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the hum of fluorescent lights, all faded into the background for Lila. For her, the world had shrunk to the fragile man in the bed, and the silent prayer that somehow she might still have time to hear the truth she knew lingered behind his eyes. Celine had always been protective of her brother, though her manner was far from gentle. Where Lila offered patience and tenderness, Celine carried an edge sharpened by years of watching Marcus rise in a world where weakness was exploited. She respected his brilliance, but she also knew his flaws, chief among them, his pride. One afternoon, while Lila stepped out to fetch coffee, Celine moved closer to Marcus's bed. Her voice dropped, carrying the stern weight of a sibling who refused to soften the truth. "Marcus," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You can't leave her blind. If you die with this secret still buried, it won't protect her. It will destroy her." Marcus's jaw tightened. Even in his frailty, he tried to summon the authority that had once silenced entire boardrooms. "She wouldn't understand," he whispered, his voice thin, each word costing him effort. Celine leaned in further, her tone unyielding. "Maybe not. But lies don't vanish when you're gone. They grow. They burn brighter than truth ever could. You've hidden this too long, Marcus. If you leave it for others to reveal, you'll break her heart twice. Once when you go, and again when she finds out you never trusted her enough." Her words pierced deeper than any medical report could. Marcus closed his eyes, unable to meet her gaze, the weight of her warning pressing harder than the machines keeping him alive. He had built his empire on strategy, on control, on carefully crafted decisions. But here in this room, control had slipped from his grasp. When Lila returned moments later, balancing a cup in trembling hands, Marcus forced a smile. He didn't want her to see the storm raging inside him. The urgency Celine's words had awakened. But the truth no longer lay quietly in the shadows. It pressed against his lips, demanding release, as if fate itself had chosen this time, this place, to demand an answer. Night folded itself around the hospital while Marcus lay awake, eyes half open, counting the intervals between each mechanical beep. Sleep came in shallow bursts, chased away by thoughts he'd managed to outrun for years. The room's quiet only sharpened the noise inside his head, the memory of signatures written under another name, transfers arranged through old contacts, birthdays remembered in silence, and a face he knew mostly from photos sent through a trusted go-between. He had told himself the lie so many times it almost sounded true, that keeping quiet had protected everyone. It had protected his company from scandal, shielded his marriage from turmoil, and preserved the carefully curated life that made investors feel safe. But that reasoning felt flimsy now, like paper held against rain. With each shallow breath he faced a fact he could no longer edit. Protection without honesty is just fear wearing a mask. Celine sat near the window, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. The earlier conversation had not satisfied her. It had only solidified her resolve. She watched her brother's chest rise and fall, then rose and moved to his bedside. "You're running out of postponements," she said quietly. "If you want to spare Lila needless pain, it has to be your voice that tells her." Marcus swallowed, the motion slow, deliberate. "I thought I could manage it," he whispered. "Different accounts, discreet arrangements. I convinced myself it was kindness." "Kindness doesn't hide in the dark," Celine replied. "It stands in the open and takes responsibility." She glanced at the doorway, as if expecting Lila at any second. "You've carried this alone too long. Don't ask her to carry it without the one thing she deserves, the truth." His gaze drifted to his hands, the same hands that had built contracts, closed deals, and waved away doubt. Now they trembled, not from illness alone, but from the knowledge that one sentence could collapse the distance he had created or widen it forever. He thought of Lila's devotion, the quiet way she had loved him when the rest of the world demanded performance. He remembered the anniversary nights when she asked for time instead of jewels, for presents instead of promises, and how he had nodded while keeping a part of himself locked away. "You're asking me to risk everything," he murmured. "You already risked everything the day you chose silence," Celine said. "This is the chance to choose differently." Marcus let the words settle. He pictured the other life connected to his own, a life he had supported from a careful distance. Report cards forwarded through intermediaries. Occasional photos framed on his private phone, never synced, never shared. A school concert he almost attended but didn't. Apologies rehearsed in an empty car and spoken to no one. Guilt tightened in his chest, distinct from the medical pain that kept him tethered to the bed. The machines continued their steady count as if marking time for a confession overdue. He closed his eyes and tried to summon the strength he had rationed for meetings and earnings calls, the determination that had once carried him through sleepless weeks. It arrived, thinner than before but still present. "Call her," he said at last, voice rough with resolve. "Bring Lila back." Celine exhaled. Not relief exactly, but a readiness sharpened by purpose. She pressed the call button for the nurse, then stepped into the hall to find Lila. Marcus turned his head toward the doorway and waited, feeling the weight of years shift inside him. He had spent so long protecting a version of his life that the real one had been forced to live in shadows. Now the shadows were lifting, one breath at a time, leaving only the path he should have taken years ago. Tell the truth and accept what follows. Lila returned quietly, balancing a cup of tea the nurse had offered her, though her hands trembled too much to drink. She set it on the table by the bed and leaned close, her voice soft. "I'm here, Marcus. You don't have to speak if it hurts." But Marcus's lips pressed together, determination etched across his weary face. His hand twitched against hers, urging her to listen. He had built companies with speeches that commanded attention, but now even a whisper carried more weight than a boardroom declaration. "Lila," his voice cracked, the syllables heavy. He paused to draw breath, his chest rising slowly under the strain. "There's something I should have told you long ago." Her brow furrowed, her instinct pulling her closer. "What is it?" she asked, steady though her heart raced. He let the silence stretch, the steady beep of the monitors filling the void. Each second hung suspended, as though the room itself was waiting. At last he forced the words out, each one a confession and a release. "I have a son." The word struck the air with finality, slicing through the sterile calm of the hospital room. His eyes welled with tears, not from pain of the body, but from the breaking of years of silence. "From before us," he continued, his voice ragged. "Before I met you. I've supported him in secret, but I was too much of a coward to face what it would mean, to face what it might do to us. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting everything, but in truth," he faltered, swallowing against the weight of guilt, "in truth, I betrayed you by not trusting you with my past." Lila's lips parted, but no words came. The room felt heavier, even the machine seemed to slow, as though giving space for the moment to settle. Family at the edges of the room glanced toward one another, startled, their whispers silenced. Marcus tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes pleading. "I couldn't leave this world without telling you. You deserved honesty even if it came too late." The revelation hung between them, unshakable and raw. Years of secrecy had collapsed into a single sentence that would change the way Lila remembered her marriage forever. For a moment, Lila could not move. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable, pressing against her chest like a weight she had never prepared to carry. Her mind replayed Marcus's confession again and again, searching for any way it could mean something different, some misunderstanding, some detail that softened the blow. But there was none. The truth was simple, stark and final. The man she had loved and defended for years had hidden an entire life from her. Her fingers loosened around his hand, not in rejection but in disbelief. She felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her standing on fragile glass. This was not the betrayal of another woman, not the breaking of vows through infidelity. It was the betrayal of silence, of trust withheld, of years lived without the honesty she had asked for again and again. Tears filled her eyes, though they did not fall immediately. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "All this time, Marcus, you let me build my life with you, believing I knew everything that mattered, and you kept this?" Her words carried no anger, only sorrow. It was the kind of sorrow that cut deeper than rage ever could, because it came from love, love that had given all and received something less in return. She looked at him, searching his face for the man she had chosen at the charity event years ago. The man who had promised her honesty was all she would ever need to ask for. Marcus closed his eyes, ashamed. His lips parted to explain, but Lila lifted her hand gently, stopping him. She didn't want excuses. No explanation could undo the years of silence. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was trust, and now she understood she had never fully received it. A single tear escaped and slid down her cheek. She didn't scream, didn't accuse, didn't walk away. Instead, she sat quietly, devastated but still present. The weight of her heartbreak filled the room, felt by everyone who witnessed it. It was not loud, but it was powerful. The silent collapse of a woman who had loved faithfully and discovered she had been left in the dark. In that fragile silence, Lila made a choice that stunned everyone present. She could have unleashed years of hurt in a storm of accusations. She could have walked away from his bedside, leaving him to face the consequence of his secrecy alone. No one in that room would have judged her for it. In fact, many might have expected it. Yet she did neither. Instead, she sat still, tears marking her cheeks, her hand resting gently on his. Though her heart fractured, she chose not to let anger speak for her. She withheld judgment, not because the truth was easy to bear, but because she understood something deeper. Judgment would only widen the distance in the final moments they still shared. It was an act of strength disguised as quiet restraint. In choosing silence over rage, compassion over condemnation, Lila shifted the meaning of the moment. She did not erase the pain, nor did she excuse it. Rather, she acknowledged it without letting it consume her. And this is where we, as listeners, must pause and reflect. How many of us would have responded differently? How many would have chosen fury instead of grace? It is easy to think we would stand above betrayal, yet in truth, most hearts bend toward hurt before they bend toward forgiveness. Lila's choice did not deny her pain. Her devastation was visible to everyone, her trembling hands, her downcast eyes, the faint quiver in her voice. But by refusing to condemn Marcus in his final hours, she revealed a strength rarely witnessed, the strength to separate love from disappointment, to allow compassion to exist alongside heartbreak. Her restraint became the most powerful response of all. It reminded those who watched, and us, who hear this story now, that real love is not measured by perfection, but by how it endures imperfection. Lila did not absolve Marcus, but she gave him the gift of presence when he least deserved it and most needed it. Marcus's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. The monitors kept their steady rhythm, yet each sound carried the weight of time slipping away. He gripped Lila's hand as though afraid that if he let go, not only would life leave him, but her love would too. His lips quivered, the words he longed to say trapped somewhere between his guilt and his failing strength. He turned his head slightly, his eyes pleading, clouded not just by illness but by regret. "Lila!" His voice broke, fragile as glass. "I'm sorry. For all the years I kept it from you. I wanted to protect us, but instead His sentence crumbled under the force of emotion. Tears welled in his eyes. Marcus Hale, the man who had once dominated boardrooms with certainty, was reduced to a husband desperate for absolution. He repeated the same fragmented words. "Forgive me. Please forgive me," as though saying them again and again might bridge the years of silence. Lila squeezed his hand, her own tears now falling freely. Her heart ached not only for the confession but for the sight of him, a man once so strong, now trembling beneath the burden of his own choices. She could see he was torn apart, not by the illness alone but by the fear that he would leave this world with her love unresolved. Around them the family stood in heavy silence, unsure if they should intervene or look away. Celine kept her gaze steady, her eyes softening for the first time. She had pushed her brother toward truth, but now even she seemed moved by his anguish. Marcus tried once more, his voice thinner than before. "Lila, I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to give you everything, but I was weak where it mattered most. Please, before I go, tell me I'm not leaving you with only pain." The room seemed to hold its breath. His plea was not just for forgiveness, it was for peace, for release from the torment of carrying regret into his final moments. He waited, his eyes locked on hers, searching for an answer that could ease the weight pressing against both his chest and his conscience. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of machines keeping time. Marcus's eyes, wet with tears, clung to Lila's face, as if the answer to his torment rested solely with her. His repeated whispers of "forgive me" carried more desperation with each attempt, yet none seemed enough to lift the weight he carried. Lila leaned closer, her voice trembling but steady with intent. "Marcus," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his damp forehead. "You don't need to keep asking." Her hand rested firmly over his, not just holding but anchoring him, reminding him he wasn't alone. He opened his mouth to plead again, but she gently pressed a finger against his lips. "No," she whispered, silencing the guilt before it spilled out once more. "You don't leave this world begging. You leave knowing that the man I loved is still the man holding my hand right now." Her words were not naive. They were not spoken to excuse his silence or erase the years of secrecy. They were spoken to show that her love, though wounded, was stronger than the regret threatening to consume him. In that moment, she gave him the one thing his empire, his wealth, and his pride could never provide: peace. Marcus blinked, tears spilling freely now, but the tension in his face eased. He tried to speak again, to express his gratitude, but his voice faltered under the weight of emotion. All he could do was squeeze her hand weakly, a final acknowledgement that her compassion had reached him where nothing else could. The family watched in awe. They expected bitterness, anger, perhaps even an outpouring of accusations. Instead, they saw a woman silencing her husband's guilt with grace, choosing mercy over rage. In a room heavy with grief, Lila's response shifted the atmosphere, transforming despair into something unexpected: dignity, love, and a quiet strength that demanded respect. For Marcus, it was enough. The man who had feared losing everything discovered at the edge of life that what mattered most could not be taken away: the love of a woman who chose compassion, even in heartbreak. In that moment, Lila chose a love stronger than betrayal. The choice was not born out of denial. She had heard his confession, felt the weight of his secrecy, and understood the depth of what had been kept from her. The wound was real, and it cut deep. Yet, instead of answering pain with pain, she chose to rise above it. Her love did not erase the truth, but it stood taller than the truth's ability to destroy her. She looked at Marcus, her expression both sorrowful and tender, and whispered, "You were wrong to believe the secret could end us. The truth does not stain love, it tests it. And even now, my love for you endures." The family members in the room shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Marcus and Lila. Some expected an eruption, others waited for anger to explode. None anticipated the calm strength in her response. By refusing to lash out, she created a silence heavier than shouting ever could, a silence that demanded reflection from everyone present. For Marcus, her words struck deeper than any judgment could have. He had prepared himself to face disappointment, to leave this world knowing he had failed her. Instead, he found himself wrapped in a mercy he believed he no longer deserved. His tears flowed freely, but for the first time in years, his breathing seemed lighter, his features less burdened. This was not a scene of perfect reconciliation. The damage of secrecy could not vanish in an instant, but what Lila gave him was something greater than simple forgiveness. She gave him a chance to die in peace, assured that the bond they had built would not be remembered as broken, but as tested and still standing. For us as an audience, her decision is both challenging and inspiring. It forces us to ask, what kind of love do we carry? A love that crumbles under betrayal, or a love that, while wounded, has the strength to endure? The room was suspended in awe. Relatives who had gathered to brace for final goodbyes now found themselves witnessing something they could not have predicted. They had expected grief, perhaps anger, maybe even the eruption of long-buried resentment. Instead, they saw a woman hold her husband's hand and choose compassion over bitterness. Celine, who had urged Marcus to confess, stood speechless. Her usual sharpness softened as she watched her sister-in-law transform a moment of despair into one of grace. She had feared that the truth would tear the marriage apart in front of everyone, but instead it revealed a strength she hadn't recognized in Lila before. For the first time, even she lowered her eyes in quiet respect. Some family members wept openly. overwhelmed not by Marcus's failing condition but by the love they had just witnessed. Others simply stood frozen, unsure how to process what they had seen. In a room where grief had loomed so heavily the atmosphere shifted. Pain was still there, but it was tempered by a reverence for the act they had all just witnessed. Marcus, barely able to keep his eyes open, looked around the room and saw their astonishment. His lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile but sincere. The approval of his family had always mattered to him, but at that moment it was their recognition of Lila's strength that comforted him most. The silence stretched on, not heavy but profound. No one dared interrupt. No one wished to diminish the sacredness of what had unfolded. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and Marcus's faint, uneven breaths. It was a moment so intimate, yet so powerful, that those present knew they would carry it with them long after Marcus was gone. For the Hale family, this was not just a farewell. It was a lesson unfolding before their eyes, that love, even in its most painful test, can rise above pride, secrets, and years of silence. Before we continue, let me pause and ask you something. Do you believe forgiveness requires strength? It's easy to talk about love when everything is smooth. It's easy to promise loyalty when life feels safe. But real love, the kind that endures pain and betrayal, demands a strength many people never discover until they are tested. Lila showed us that strength when she chose compassion over anger, grace over revenge. Her decision didn't erase her hurt, but it revealed a truth that everyone in that hospital room, and all of us listening to this story now, cannot ignore. Forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is power. The power to rise above what breaks you. The power to decide that bitterness will not define you. The power to give peace, even when every part of you aches. So if you believe forgiveness requires true strength, tap that like button right now. Let it be a symbol that you stand with those who choose mercy when the world expects rage. And if this story has touched you so far, share it with someone who might need the reminder that compassion is stronger than pride. The night stretched on, and Marcus's breathing grew more uneven. Each inhale was shallow, each exhale fragile, like the last notes of a song nearing its end. Lila never loosened her grip on his hand, holding him with the same devotion that had carried her through years of love and uncertainty. Around them, the family remained silent, witnesses to a farewell they knew was close. Marcus's eyes fluttered open one final time. His gaze settled on Lila, as if imprinting her face into his memory before the darkness claimed him. His lips moved, barely forming words. "Thank you," he whispered, so faint that only she could hear. She leaned closer, brushing his cheek with trembling fingers. "Rest now," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You've carried enough." A moment later, the monitors told the truth no one wanted to face. The steady rhythm flattened, the soft hum of machinery signaling the end. A rush of movement followed as nurses entered, but Lila already knew. She lowered her head gently onto his chest, tears falling freely, not in rage but in release. She had carried him to his final breath with love, even when love had been tested beyond measure. The family stood frozen, their grief compounded by what they had just witnessed. Celine pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. For all her determination to push Marcus into honesty, she had not expected to see such tenderness in his final moments. When the staff finally withdrew, leaving the family alone, the room remained filled with a profound stillness. It was not just the silence of death, it was the silence left behind when secrets are finally spoken, and the people who remain must decide how to live with them. Lila kissed her husband's forehead, closing her eyes as she did. "You were flawed," she whispered softly, "but you were mine. And I choose to remember the love we shared, even with the cracks." Her words were for him, but also for herself, a way of anchoring her grief in acceptance rather than bitterness. That night, the legacy of Marcus Hale shifted. No longer just the story of a wealthy CEO, it became the story of a man whose final hours revealed both the cost of secrecy and the power of forgiveness. Weeks after the funeral, the Hale family gathered in a stately office lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and thick curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The air was heavy with expectation. They had come to hear the reading of Marcus's will, a formality for some, but for others the moment that would define what remained of his empire. The lawyer, an older man with a calm demeanor, opened a folder and began reading in measured tones. Much of it was expected: the distribution of assets, trusts arranged for relatives, and provisions for philanthropic causes Marcus had supported. Heads nodded, sighs of relief escaped. But then the lawyer's voice shifted slightly, and the room stilled. "There is one final matter," he said, glancing over the document. "Marcus Hale acknowledges within this will a son, Theo." The name fell like a stone into still water. Conversation stopped mid-breath, and all eyes turned toward the young man seated quietly at the edge of the room. Barely 18, Theo's presence had been arranged by Celine, who believed he deserved recognition at last. He wore a modest suit, his posture uncertain, his gaze fixed downward as though the carpet could protect him from the weight of 100 eyes. Whispers rippled through the family. Some expressions hardened, others softened in sudden understanding. A few exchanged looks that confirmed old suspicions, others reacted with disbelief. For years they had speculated that Marcus kept secrets, but no one expected this truth to be revealed so publicly, with legal ink making it undeniable. Lila sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The name echoed in her ears, yet she remained composed. This was not news to her anymore. Marcus had spoken his truth in his final days. But hearing it spoken aloud, written into the fabric of his legacy, gave it a permanence she could not ignore. Theo finally lifted his eyes. His expression was a mixture of fear and longing, as though he wasn't sure if he belonged in that room or if he was trespassing on a life denied to him until now. He didn't speak, but his presence alone posed the question none dared to voice. Would the Hale family accept him or cast him aside? For some, this was the birth of conflict, a challenge to inheritance, to image, to everything Marcus had carefully built. But for Lila, it was also the beginning of something else, an opportunity to decide whether Marcus's final truth would tear them further apart or open the door to healing. When the room settled into tense silence after Theo's name had been spoken, all eyes inevitably turned toward Lila. For decades she had been Marcus's partner, the woman who upheld the family's dignity and carried herself with quiet strength. Now she was faced with a choice that could either fracture what remained of that dignity or transform it into something more profound. She rose from her chair slowly, every movement deliberate. Her eyes rested on Theo, not with judgment, but with curiosity and compassion. The boy's shoulders tightened as though he was preparing for rejection. He had lived long enough with whispers about his existence. He knew the power of silence and what it meant to be left in the shadows. But Lila did not turn away. Instead, she crossed the distance between them, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. When she stopped in front of him, she studied his face, searching not for Marcus's reflection but for Theo's individuality. In his features she saw traces of Marcus, the determined jaw, the sharp eyes, but she also saw vulnerability, a youthfulness untouched by the privileges that had defined her own children's upbringing. "You have his name," she said softly, her voice carrying through the stillness, "but you are not defined by his secrets." Theo looked at her, unsure whether to believe her words. His lips parted, but no sound came. Years of silence could not be undone in a single moment. Yet in her tone he found something unfamiliar, an invitation to step forward instead of retreat. Lila reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "If Marcus chose to acknowledge you now in this way, then my role is not to turn you away. It is to make sure you do not bear the weight of what he hid, Her words shocked some in the room. Others lowered their heads, realizing the strength it took to extend acceptance rather than bitterness. For the first time since Marcus's confession, the burden began to shift, not vanish, but transform into a chance for healing. By choosing to embrace Theo, Lila broke a cycle that had begun with Marcus's silence. She understood that secrecy corrodes trust, that omission can wound deeper than betrayal. Her decision was not about erasing Marcus's fault, but about ensuring that his legacy did not end with shame and division. In that moment, the Hale family witnessed a different kind of power. Not wealth, not status, but grace. And for Theo, the boy once hidden, it was the first time he felt truly seen. Marcus Hale was a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms, whose photograph appeared on magazine covers, and whose fortune allowed him to live in ways most people could only dream about. Yet when the truth pressed on his conscience, none of that status or wealth offered him peace. His bank account could not silence the late-night thoughts that left him staring at city lights. His penthouse, filled with every luxury, could not shield him from the dread of his secret being discovered. This reveals a sobering truth. Wealth can build comfort, but it cannot erase inner fear. Power can influence markets and sway decisions, but it has no authority over the human heart. Marcus could sign multi-million-dollar contracts with confidence, yet he trembled at the thought of exposing his past mistake to his wife. The contrast is stark. A man seen as fearless in business was deeply afraid in the privacy of his home. His fear was not of losing money, but of losing love. That fear grew precisely because he clung to the illusion that material success could somehow compensate for emotional dishonesty. Life teaches us that true strength is not measured in possessions or influence, but in the courage to live openly, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Marcus's story is proof that hiding behind success only deepens fear. Facing it, however, allows space for real freedom. When Marcus finally confessed his hidden truth, he expected condemnation. He braced himself for anger, for an outburst that would match the weight of his secret. Yet what he received instead was something far more powerful: forgiveness. Lila's response was not weakness, as some might assume, but the purest form of strength. It takes far more courage to forgive than to lash out. Anger often rises quickly and demands little effort, but forgiveness requires deep self-control, empathy, and the ability to see beyond the moment of hurt. Her choice to silence Marcus's guilt with compassion stunned everyone in the room. While others gasped or shifted uncomfortably, she looked at her husband, not as the CEO who failed her trust, but as the man she had loved through his flaws, ambitions, and fears. Her decision to forgive in his final moments was not just for him, it was also for herself. By letting go of resentment, she freed her own heart from the weight of bitterness. This moment demonstrates a timeless truth. Forgiveness is not about excusing wrongs or pretending wounds don't exist. It is about reclaiming power over pain and choosing peace over chaos. Marcus left this world knowing that despite his failures, he was still loved. And Lila, though hurt, walked forward without carrying anger as her burden. Forgiveness, then, is not weakness. It is the strongest act of all. Pride had been Marcus's greatest obstacle. It was pride that kept him silent, convincing him that admitting his secret would weaken his image and diminish the authority he worked so hard to build. Yet in the end, all the walls of pride collapsed in the quiet of a hospital room. His wealth, his titles, and his reputation mattered little as his final breath approached. What endured was not the empire he created, but the love that remained between him and Lila. Lila's response revealed something extraordinary. Love is not bound by pride, nor is it limited by death. She had every reason to let her heartbreak consume her, but instead, she chose to let love guide her actions. Even as Marcus's life faded, her hand did not pull away. She affirmed her commitment to stand with him, not because he was perfect, but because true love survives imperfection. Her final act showed that real devotion continues beyond the grave. When she later embraced Theo, Marcus's son, it was not only an extension of compassion but also a continuation of the love she had promised Marcus years earlier. She kept her vow to honor him not only in moments of happiness but also in the trials that came at the end. The lesson is clear: pride builds barriers, but love breaks them down. Death may silence a heartbeat, but it cannot silence a love that chooses grace over bitterness. Stories like Marcus and Lila's remind us that the lessons of life are not confined to wealth, influence, or even mistakes. They are written in the choices we make when faced with pain. And in this story, the greatest choice was compassion. If this story has touched you, if it made you reflect on the weight of truth, the courage it takes to forgive, or the power of love to endure beyond hardship, I invite you to take action. Help spread these lessons so they can reach others who may need them. Tap that like button if you believe strength is shown not just in power but in kindness. Share this story with friends and loved ones who might draw encouragement from it. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the many more stories of humanity, struggle, and redemption that are still to come. Together, we can build a community that doesn't shy away from life's hard truths but embraces them, finding meaning and hope in every twist of the human journey. By subscribing and sharing, you become part of something larger, a reminder to the world that compassion is still the strongest force we have. So if this story spoke to you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe, and let's continue walking this path of storytelling, lessons, and inspiration, side by side. As we reach the end of Marcus and Lila's story, the lessons stand out like markers along a path. Truth sustains love. Wealth cannot erase fear. Forgiveness requires extraordinary strength. And love endures even beyond death. Each of these truths reflects not only their journey but also challenges us to look at our own lives with honesty. Marcus represents the struggle many face, the temptation to hide flaws behind success, to guard secrets for fear of losing respect or affection. Lila represents the other side of the human heart, the courage to stand in the presence of pain and still choose grace. Together, their lives form a reminder that relationships are not built on perfection, but on trust, humility, and compassion. The story does not end with Marcus's passing. It continues in the way Lila embraced Theo, turning what could have been a legacy of shame into one of healing. That single choice carried the power to rewrite a future, not just for herself, but for a young man who might otherwise have lived in the shadow of silence. So as you step away from this story, carry its lessons with you. Let honesty shape your relationships. Let forgiveness guard your peace. And let love in its truest form guide your choices, even when pride or fear tempts you otherwise. Because in the end, we are all remembered not for the titles we held or the riches we owned, but for the way we chose to love.